controversial topic in American society, which shapeshifts and has many different facets. Why is everything about race argument? Race functions psychologically as a cognitive shortcut, not because it is accurate, but because it is efficient. When individuals function from a race based ideology, this is their brain's attempt to conserve energy. If I can group thousands of people into one category, it saves me time having to go through each person, analyze their values, their character, etc. So it's a conservation strategy. It's a lazy brain. The human brain is biologically wired to conserve glucose, the fuel required for high order reasoning, moral evaluation, and nuanced character assessment. Individually evaluating people based on their merit, values, behavior, and context is metabolically expensive. Categorization, especially visual categorization like race, reduces cognitive load. It allows the brain to make rapid judgments without investing energy into deeper analysis. In modern technological economies where attention spans are shortened, so we live in a society where we have an increase in social media, swipe culture, which continues to co-facilitate the brain not having to put out as much effort and work. You just swipe a button, you push a button, the information is there. So, in modern technological economies where attention spans are shortened, swiping replaces reflection and algorithms reward speed over accuracy. These shortcuts become even more reinforced. Why is everything about race is a orientation of a person rooted in fight or flight emotional processing who chooses to bypass the data, the research, the amount of money invested into seeing the psychological, emotional impacts of race based discrimination against individuals in employment, sectors of housing, relationships, etc. So it says the why is everything about race argument emerges here not as curiosity, but as emotional reasoning. So, what is emotional reasoning? It's one of the cognitive distortions in psychology where an individual has a negative emotion and they orient themselves to this feeling by translating it into some objective reality or fact. And when this happens, they're basically saying that my emotion, which is temporary based off of a transitory condition, is an absolute reality. You see people engaging in emotional reasoning a lot, where if I feel bad, it must mean because I'm a bad person. If I feel fear, it must be because you're doing something that's putting me in danger. So, a lot of these, why is everything about race arguments are very much driven by the person's state of frustration, resentment towards any sort of identity threat. And then they orient and translate that emotion into, oh, it must be because these people are weak. Oh, it must be because these people are making excuses, etc. So it says here, emotional reasoning is a psychological state where discomfort is treated as evidence. When identity threat activates the brain's fight or flight response, regions responsible for logic, moral reasoning, and evidence evaluation reduce activity as blood flow, oxygen, and glucose are redirected to emotional survival centers. In this state, data is dismissed, history is denied, and race, despite overwhelming evidence of its influence on housing, employment, education, and economic outcome, is framed as an invention rather than a system. Denial then is not ignorance, it is maintenance. So, denial is the new maintenance. This is a way that I can continue things as they are and keep receiving the benefits that I am receiving as the system progresses in this state. One, denial reduces cognitive effort and it preserves comfort. Denial is historically a psychological defense used to avoid threats to a person's identity, status, or moral self image. Acknowledging racial inequity requires sustained mental effort, holding contradictory information, confronting inherited advantage, and tolerating moral discomfort. And this is why I believe a lot of these white identity extremists, black identity extremists across the board who are positions of power will never put effort into removing race based realities because they're not going to challenge their comfort zones. It's just not going to happen. And that's why I believe there has to be a new strategy in the African American community where we have to reorient ourselves in different directions. We're not going to change people. We're not going to convince people. It's a waste of effort trying to debate people because they've already made up their minds. It says denial resolves this tension quickly by dismissing the premise entirely. This allows the individual to return to emotional equilibrium without cognitive cost. Resume audit studies conducted by Harvard and the University of Chicago repeatedly show that applicants with black sounding names receive 30 to 50% fewer callbacks than identical resumes with white sounding names. So here you have corporate America already bought in. They have these systems and these companies in these employment sectors already established based on your race, which is why the job market is chaotic and crashing because you can't have a healthy work economy when you're holding extremist ideologies and you're camouflaging it under a 9 to 5 W 2 paycheck. It's not going to work. These findings have been replicated from 2003 through 2020 across industries. Denial allows these outcomes to be framed as coincidence rather than systemic bias, preserving both comfort and the status quo. Emotional reasoning replaces evidence processing. Emotional reasoning occurs when a person concludes that because something feels threatening, it must be false or malicious. Why is everything about race? Signals that the speaker's nervous system has shifted from analysis to protection. Once they are in a fight or flight state, the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for logic and ethical reasoning, shows decreased activity. Neuroscience research consistently shows that under a perceived threat, the brain reallocates glucose and oxygen towards the amygdala and the limbic system. The amygdala is this almond shaped region in the brain that's responsible for emotional memory, both positive and negative. Also, it is responsible for the physiological responses in the fight or flight system, your racing heart rate, your tightness in the stomach. Some people have very increased awareness of their body, their physical body. If they feel any little bit of slight anxiety, they go, radioactive. And racism is not just limited to ideology alone, it is also connected to the human being's nervous system. And people who don't have regulation abilities, tools, strategies to be able to sit with discomfort when you're holding two opposing ideas from each other, that tends to further perpetuate the denial. And this is why evidence on racial disparities is often rejected without being examined. In employment contexts, denial allows hiring managers and systems to avoid interrogating biased outcomes. If race doesn't matter, then unequal outcomes require no correction. The burden shifts to individuals rather than systems. In 2017, the National Bureau of Economic Research study found that Black applicants without criminal records were less likely to receive callbacks than white applicants with records. These disparities persisted even when education and experience were controlled. Denial ensures these patterns continue unchallenged. And that's something that white identity extremists are really good at. Black people can deny it all day, but it's just water under the bridge a lot of times because we're such, a very, small population. But when your group holds the greatest social power, there is a social power that's at play, even to the extent where you have some Asian countries. even African, Jamaican, where they'll go to extremes to just bleach their skin because of just sort of this social narrative and narration around, white is right. So that social power has very significant impact and influence, and just one denial from a white identity extremist in a position of power can have just drastic influence on not only youth of the white community, but also of different cultures. So don't be ignorant, right? Do what you want to do, but I'm gonna keep doing me. So it says here, housing denial preserves wealth stratification. Housing is one of the clearest examples of denial as maintenance. Racialized housing outcomes are framed as market forces rather than policy outcomes, allowing inequality to appear natural rather than engineered. Brookings Institute research shows homes in majority black neighborhoods are valued 20 to 25% lower than similar homes in white neighborhoods. Appraisal studies confirm that simply changing perceived race of the homeowners alters the valuation. Denial allows wealth gaps to persist without moral scrutiny. Education denial sustains opportunity gaps. Denying race's role in education reframes inequity as individual failure rather than structural design. This shifts responsibility away from funding models, zoning laws, and access to advanced coursework. The U.S. Department of Education data shows Black students are 3 times more likely to attend underfunded schools and significantly less likely to have access to AP courses or gifted programs. These disparities directly correlate with long term income and employment outcomes. Extremist ideologies thrive when emotional certainty replaces evidence. Denial simplifies the world into us versus them, reducing cognitive complexity and reinforcing identity protection. Political psychology studies show that individuals high in emotional reactivity and threat sensitivity are more likely to adopt absolutist beliefs and resist corrective information. Race based denial functions as an emotional anchor that stabilizes extremist worldviews. Yeah, you just get tired of being in environments where, you have to be so PC and so politically. All politically correct is it's just a term that's used in environments where you're basically in an environment dominated by white identity extremists, and you're afraid to speak to your struggles. You're afraid to speak to your experiences of racism and discrimination against white identity extremists in these environments because, oh, I'm going to receive backlash. Oh, are they going to call my job and I'm going to get fired? These white identity extremists, you do a really good job at using sort of like emotional manipulation and projection in order to install like this unconscious fear in marginalized groups in America, where PC just becomes sort of like this defense mechanism where it's like, oh, I can't talk about, all the years, Randy, I was getting my ass tore up, from racism because, I got my white boss here and I got these white coworkers here. And, it's just a bunch of bullshit. So here we have some more research, which is why I love YouTube, because whether this channel gets monetized or not, I could care less. I'm still going to keep educating and speaking to the facts, what the research says here. Across the United States, patterns of intolerance. You're starting to see a rise in intolerance where people just can't sit with their own discomfort around beliefs that they don't agree with. Across the United States, patterns of intolerance towards differing ideologies, worldviews, and experiences have grown markedly in recent decades, not just in politics, but in everyday social life. Data from national surveys show that the share of Americans who hold consistently liberal or consistently conservative views has doubled over the past 2 decades, increasing from about 10% to 21% of adults, meaning more people are clustered at the ideological extremes rather than in the center. At the same time, Americans overwhelmingly report that political and social divisions feel threatening. In one social attitudes data set, 87% of respondents said they see political polarization as a threat to America. 86% reported feeling exhausted by division, and 77% believe people on the opposing side pose a danger to the country. These trends reflect not only policy disagreements, but deeper emotional reactions linked to threat perception. From a psychological and neurobiological perspective, this pattern aligns with how the brain responds to perceived threat. When individuals feel uncertain or defensive, the amygdala, a key threat detection center in the brain, becomes more active, while areas responsible for rational, evidence based processing and moral reasoning become less active. Studies on political cognition found that people with higher intolerance of uncertainty, a psychological trait related to discomfort with ambiguity, exhibit greater neurosynchrony with like minded peers and less engagement with opposing views, reinforcing emotional reactions over analytical processing. In such states, rather than engaging in fact driven dialogue, individuals default to defensive, emotionally reactive strategies that inhibit compromise, empathy, or problem solving with those perceived as other. This pattern of defensiveness and intolerance is not only psychological, it shows up in social attitudes towards difference and change. In a national opinion data tracking attitudes toward racial inequity and discrimination, a notable portion of Americans disagree with structural explanations for racial disparities. In 2024, around 44% of respondents said that Black people face a lot or a great deal of discrimination, down from 50% in 2020, while beliefs that Black people could be just as well off as white people hovered around 45%. These figures suggest that a significant share of the population views racial inequity through individualistic or dismissive lenses rather than structural ones. And the Black folks don't really help the argument because when they see us on the television, making all this money through hip hop music, we've created these sort of tunnels, of survival in America through music, through sports, especially through music. And they see us flashing money. They see us with all this jewelry and the influence that we have. And we can't control what other people think about us, but it just sends the message that these Black folks are all right. They're doing well. They're making more money than me. They're throwing money all over the fucking strip clubs. What do these Black folks have to complain about, right? So they take like a really small percentage of us and then they try to generalize it to the whole community to minimize the structural discrimination and racism that is in the American economic system. So it says these figures suggest that a significant share of the population views racial inequity through individualistic or dismissive lenses rather than structural ones, an outlook consistent with emotionally oriented reasoning that filters discomfort before engaging complex evidence. The consequence of this emotional defensive posture is tangible in civic and democratic engagement. When polarization deepens, people become less willing to engage with those outside their ideological bubble, and cooperation falters. Research shows that increasing affective polarization of affect is just the express of emotion. So when they say affective polarization, just sort of like this emotional extreme that's occurring in America, meaning greater emotional dislike or political outgroups links with greater willingness to exclude ideological opponents from social and civic spaces. So now it starts at the emotional level where I can't tolerate any sort of discomfort that comes from the difference in your belief system, your ideology. So it starts at a sort of like a neurobiological level. Then it attaches to narratives and narrations that sort of keep this bubble or this comfort zone in place. And then people are groups that represent different beliefs. Now we're polarized. I can't live in this community because they're all Republican or Democrat or they're too liberal. I can't live in this stuff. Just at the physiological level, it kind of just sprouts up into beliefs, political ideologies. Now you're moving in different locations. It goes into the real estate. Now it goes into employment. Oh, I don't want to work here. It's too many Black folks in here. I don't want to eat there. It's too many niggas here. We don't eat there. It's too many white people here. This thing is just a fucking mess. So it says the self-segregation of thought weakens dialogue across differences and makes meaningful resolution of systemic issues, including race, economic inequality, or a policy disagreement, even more difficult. In other words, the fight or flight response triggered by ideological threat pushes many into reactive intolerance that shuts down evidence gathering and empathetic understanding, further reinforcing division or even bridging it. Have a good day.